Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Hello and welcome to Half the Answer, where knowing the question is half the answer. I am Caitlin M. Green, linguist and editor at Liberal Currents, and with me is my co-host Trent R. Nelson, a historian and also an editor at Liberal Currents. And Trent, who did you bring for me today?
Well, you know that I, just like you, only bring the heat. I have El Jefe. I have Adam Gurri. He's the editor-in-chief at Liberal Currents, and you know he makes sure that everything is running smoothly. And well, anyone who's read the work at Liberal Currents knows that tackling all of the most important topics going on right now. How's it going, Adam?
Good. Thank you for having me.
We better be on best behavior today. The boss is here.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure to have you, Adam. Now, Adam, the president, the 47th and 45th president, you have obviously spoken about him. Everyone has spoken about him. He continues to be spoken about constantly. That's part of his deal. Now, many people look at how he is running his term, his administration, and you hear words like autocratic, like fascist, like monarchical, but you've been using another word quite frequently, and it's personalist, right? And personalism. What are those things, sir?
Yeah, so it's not like Trump doesn't have some substantive beliefs, or his coalition doesn't. You know, everyone knows they're nationalists. They hate immigrants. They hate LGBTQ rights in general, especially trans peoples. Um, you know, they have a bunch of cultural grievances. But really and truly, what Donald Trump is looking out for Donald Trump. And, you know, people are sort of aware of that as well. It's an obvious point. It's been pointed out a lot of times when people are focusing on the corruption aspect. But I think it's easy to underestimate how central that aspect really is. And at the end of the day, if Donald Trump had to side with the transgender community in order to get more personal power, I'm pretty sure that he would, if that was his path that was available to him.
Right.
So personalism in political science, we tend to think of dictatorships. I think, you know, non-political scientists tend to think of dictatorship and non-democracy as all sort of the same thing. When we talk about losing democracy, we talk about like the Nazis, or we talk about the Soviets, and we think, you know, those are the main things. But then we also talk about Putin, and we talk about China today, and really those are very different systems from one another. So personalists are more like what your classic dictator is when you think of just one man who has a lot of personal power, and rules through rewarding loyalists and punishing enemies, and that is the main substance of their rule. You know,
Right.
maybe they have a right-wing inflection, or maybe they have a left-wing inflection to it, but really it's really just all about their personal power, and they will undermine the effectiveness of their own institutions in order to make sure that it is difficult for anyone to gain any power that could be used to oppose them within those institutions. So a lot of what we see now with Trump is very, you know, par for the course, in the sense that, you know, how are you possibly making America great when you're specifically undermining the ability of our institutions to perform, by gutting a bunch of federal agencies, and defunding a bunch of scientific institutions. But you know, if you're undermining anything that is independent of your own personal power, it makes, you know, the story makes more sense. There's not a story of seeking national greatness here. There is a story of, it doesn't really matter how much total power the federal government has or America as a country has in the world. What matters is Trump's personal power. And so that's, you know, that's sort of the basic idea of personalism. A good contrast case is China. The many phases of China actually is good for both sides of it. Mao was very much a personalist. He actually did not have that much formal power. He ruled almost entirely through the personal charisma that he had and popularity he had that he could mobilize through things through like the Cultural Revolution against any enemies in the party. Um, the post Deng reform period was a very not personalized system. So with even though they were not a democracy, China before Xi has formal rotation in office, which is something that's very hard for non-democracies to do
Right.
usually. And the Soviet Union was absolutely terrible at it, and it was usually a bloodbath every time they had to have a change of hands. But China actually, for a generation or so, managed to pull off regular rotation in office. So that was an institutionalized dictatorship, or not even dictatorship, but non one party state. Um, and now again, Xi has consolidated his power and uh, extended his term beyond what the limits were, and
Right.
openly punished former holders of the office to just sort of like a symbolic, just showing that like no matter how esteemed you are in the party, really what matters is your personal connection to Xi. So once again, they're sort of swinging back in this personalist direction. And it's just very different. It's just the implications are very different. China was never perfect before Xi, between Deng and Xi. Um, Obviously, they accomplished a lot in terms of growth, but there's tons of corruption, there's tons of dysfunction. People tend to understate those things, but you can pull out a lot of what they pull off in a more institutionalized non-democracy. Um, when you have personalism, it gets a lot harder. It's a lot more just tied to the contingencies of the
Individuals.
person.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they are almost never going to choose to prioritize the well-being of the society over the security of their position. And that includes not prioritizing the effectiveness of, again, as I said, the effectiveness of their own government and the own tools they have at their disposal, if those tools could be turned against them at some point.
So, what happens to a personalist leader when they have leveraged all of those things and their country experiences things like, a recession, a brain drain, a lot of people in poverty who weren't in poverty before? Does that impact their status then as a personalist leader?
Right. So there's a few things. One is that if you get a spoil system set up, it can just not matter. If the spoil system is good enough, if they're good enough at playing off their opponents against one another. Now Trump is a very old man, so I don't know like from him personally how that's going to go long term. Um, but you sort of the country ends up stagnating for various reasons because of all the corruption, of all the institutional dysfunction. Um, but if you control enough of the resources and keep enough people that have power happy and dependent on you, first and foremost,
Right.
you can stick around for a really long time. You can stick around until you die. Um, then what it really becomes is this vicious cycle of either you, after the person does die, you transition to some very fragile democracy that has a high chance of failing, or you just go through a cycle of coups and counter coups. Essentially, you've set up a situation where there is no regular transition of power anymore. There's no process to do it. So every time it comes up, it has to be this very dangerous, transitional moment where you could end up with a worse dictator. You could end up with some more of the same, kind of like Egypt. You
Right.
could end up with a sort of like very weak democracy that degrades into like maybe not personalist, but like Mexico for a long time had a one party system that was not really like a China thing where they were going to kill you if they overthrew the party. It was just that they had a very strong patronage system that made it difficult to throw them out through elections. But then Mexico developed as a country, became wealthier through various contingencies, and people became more willing to, risk that patronage and just vote them out because they thought they were terrible at doing their job. So you can end up with a situation like that where it's kind of like an imperfect democracy. There's like a huge gray area between a full-fledged consolidated liberal democracy and an actual non-democracy.
Right.
And going from a personalist who has died or been thrown out of office by force you enter a situation where probably your most likely cases are either that being in that middle zone where you're not quite a democracy, but not quite the opposite, um, or just an outright someone else takes power, non-democracy.
Right. And again, I think that it's interesting the points that you brought up in terms of the options that sort of play themselves out after the death of a personalist leader. We just talked about China's response, though, to the death of Mao Zedong, right? And
Yeah,
the decision to sort of like, for lack of a better term, call a sort of like personalist truce. Like,
yeah.
okay, like now let's all sort of share this right now. This was a little bit hairy. Let's all share this and it'll work better. So then Xi Jinping gets into power, and as you noted, sir, it sort of returns to this personalist mentality. Do you see it wavering back? Do you see that these sort of personalist innovations are really more related to the sort of power of the individual, the sort of magic quality of them to some degree that garners this sort of respect that turns into power over time?
The way I see it is that institutions in general are more fragile than we tend to think in terms of how much they rely on people just sort of following the going along with. So for example, when people talk about rule of law in America, they tend to think it's judges, that's their job. It's the job of the courts to make sure we have rule of law, whereas I think that's completely incorrect. Courts are always a last resort, and uh, they're not a very good one, because in order for them to be an effective last resort, the rest of the system has to listen to them. And in America, we have a fairly remarkable history. As much as I dislike judicial supremacy and things like that, the fact of the matter is that when I was drilling down to do research on the history of the Voting Rights Act, um, at the end of the day, there would not be as outright a defiance as you would expect from some of these Jim Crow localities when the microscope was on them and they were being watched. So there wasn't really like defiance of court orders. There was trying to wiggle around it, and they
Right.
had all kinds of creative ways of doing this. And what they did was instead was play a game where we'll make a very small change and say that we're complying with it, and then it's going to take you time to come back and try and enforce it again. And that's how we keep this going for longer than you can keep coming back. Um, uh, so you get that, but outright defiance actually was kind of rare. Um, so, you know, really and truly, you get rule of law through the actions of the huge body of people in the government. It's
Right.
got to be the president, obviously. It's got to be Congress to some extent as well. But it's got to be just the civil service overall, too. Um, when a court tells them to stop, they stop, regardless of whether or not the president says they should still keep going. Um, so it takes a lot of people. And the way that I see the long term effect of a personalist, even after they're gone, is a personalist is like a wrecking ball that just completely destroys that. Like, you have an arrangement um, that has its problems, but more or less works to get something like rule of law as close as anything can get. And then a personalist comes in and just starts undermining that. He uses they can the Mao approach is again using a sort of mass support um, to do it, to apply pressure to the institutions, or even directly get people involved, beating the crap out of officials
Right.
as he did. Um, Trump does that to some extent because he's got a mass following in the MAGA types, and that he the way he uses that is mostly through the primary system. Um, but then you also have the Xi approach, which is much more changing the institution through the institution.
Right.
Just changing the rules over time to be more to your benefit. And then of course there's patronage, and Trump has all three for the most part. Like the Project 2025 people are all we're going to figure out how to game the institution as it exists in order to turn it into a personalist executive branch. Trump always does the patronage thing. I mean, he always like gets, gives spoils to he'll pardon you if you're his pal. He get rid of anti-bribery, executive orders, and things like that. And then he's also got the charisma, thing.
Right. I mean, Project 2012 was essentially a shadow government, which is a topic that you and I have spoken about before, Adam. This sort of think tank sitting in the wings, developing policy, parsing through the paperwork, the legality, the case studies, right, the case law, and determining how can we do this? What is the recourse for here? But again, what I'm gathering from your response to my question concerning personalism was very much that it is sort of a full social and or institutional pushback. It
Yeah,
is it
yeah,
is this wrecking ball has come in and just crushed us. We've got to reassemble a bit of order here. Let's all take
right.
turns and make sure that we're doing this right now to some degree.
Right. I mean, the optimistic case is there are plenty of problems, and plenty of problems with the system as it existed. And if you wreck something, then that's a chance to fix it better. The reality is that when you risk it, most likely scenario is it just gets worse. Um, like that's that that because um, the problems with it are tied in with what makes it work. Um, and when you break something down, first of all, the existence of someone like Trump and the political fight and polarization around him just makes it so much harder for enough of society to then work together to actually rebuild something afterwards. Um, Second of all, uh, you know, once the genie is out of the bottle and you don't have rule of law and people are just going after enemies, it's sort of like, okay, the truce is over. Once you get power, then I'm going after my enemies, because if I
Right.
don't, then you will when you get power. The long term effect is really just sort of up until a certain point, there are certain lines that wouldn't be crossed in politics, because much like in China, for those that brief period of time, among the members of the party in their case, not broader. Um, we all have this peaceful thing, and that means that I know that when I leave power, it's not going to be risking my neck,
Right.
because I didn't go after the guy before me, and the next guy after me isn't going to go after me, and I'll still be a member in good standing. Um, and that's how it is. And you can see it with people like Chuck Schumer and the Democrats that still want to live in a world where they can negotiate.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, so here, one thing that occurred to me today, a practice in the Senate that people probably aren't even aware of. So there was the case this week. Was it last week? Anyway, last few days. The Columbia student who was deported because he protested the war in Gaza. Um, they whisked him off to Louisiana. And why did they whisk him off to Louisiana so quickly? Because the judges there are more conservative.
Right.
Why are the judges in Louisiana specifically more conservative? I mean, after all, judge spots come up when they come up. Like, why would a conservative state have conservative judges and New York have liberal judges? Trump was president when he was president, and Democrats were president when they were president. Why would that matter? It's because the Senate has a norm, not a rule, not a law, just a norm of, if a judge comes up in your state, then your senator for your state gets to be the one who picks who they are,
Right.
or at least has a say. So even when they are conservative-ish judges, for the most part, they're sane ones, and that's just a norm. And the thought that I had just today, frankly, was, if we ever get the trifecta, that norm's got to go in the garbage,
Yeah.
because
Right.
they've thrown everything else out, and we
Yeah.
just got to fill all of the courts everywhere that we can with liberal justices.
Right.
And of course, we also need to pack the Supreme Court. I mean,
Yeah.
but
We've been
that's
saying that
another.
for a while.
Yeah.
Well, even more than a fascist government proper, I think, and I've been thinking a lot over the last several months, that trust is the number one thing that is being destroyed right now. Because
Oh, absolutely.
as you noted,
Yeah.
Adam, whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, under a personalist regime, we can't even really conceive of what we can rely on and what we can't rely
Yeah.
on, because at
Well,
any point it's on the whim of the individual, right?
like, you know, I mean, you've heard from the Mexico and Canada negotiations about tariffs. Like, the thing that drives them crazy is, like, Trump can't even give them something to concede, like, because he just wants to do it, you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
But they're like, okay, well, what can we give you? And he's like Mr. Deal Maker, apparently, in his head, right? But they're like, okay,
Sure.
so what deal can we make here? And he can't even give them anything. They're frustrated. They're like, well, what do you want from us? You know, like, what can we even give you?
Pain.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so then they give him something, and then he's like, all right, I'll give you a month. And he's like, yeah, but I still kind of want to do it. Like, you know, and
Right.
it's just like, he always is like, I'm going to punt it forward a month. And you just never know. And like, yeah, you can't trust it. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. And then people wonder why everything feels so chaotic. Like,
right.
Right.
I have a question that goes to this idea that, like, you only have judicial power if people are listening to it, right? So let's say, for example, you have packed a plane with people who may or may not have committed crimes, and you are sending it to El Salvador, and the court says, turn that plane around. That's not going to work. We need due process for these people. Who is it that then can either listen or not listen to the courts, and what happens to them if they choose to listen?
Yeah. And this is something where, like, the precision of my understanding isn't where it should be. A court can apply sanctions. Um, but I'm not 100% clear on who would be enforcing that on the executive branch. There, you know, that's I'd have to look that up. But either way, it's going to be a shit show, because
Absolutely.
the people that you would be enforcing it on are law enforcement themselves,
Mhm.
and it's just, that has never been, no, they've never pushed that. You know what I mean? And
Right.
we talk about how strong our courts are, or how our Supreme Court is, but like, so, you know, Marshall, the very first chief
Here we go.
justice that put us on that path, at least in terms of jurisprudence. I mean, I
Yeah.
think institutionally it was just structurally biased to be this way. Um, but he's sort of like the father of the idea of judicial review. Um, he came up with that idea in a case that he was essentially letting the other side win the victory, um, because at the end of the day, a confrontation with the president is just not something that the Supreme Court can win on its own.
Right.
And they've always known this, and they've only ever acted when they knew that they were in a position to do so. Um, so I just don't think, it's hard for me to see. I think some judge may try and test this with some low level people, just to try and flex their muscles, and I hope they do. I really do hope they do, because at this point, there's enough excuses for them too. It's not even just that one,
Right.
Right.
but that one they're
Well,
doing
and
very bluntly.
the alternative is lying down, and that's really not acceptable. So,
Yeah. Well, one of the cases, the case for the professor that got deported or not allowed reentry or something,
right.
the judge backed down on that one because they were like, "Oh, okay, your explanation makes sense," and they, like, you know, so like, the judges, like, I think people don't understand how much judges usually do defer to the executive branch. Like,
Right.
we have this idea in our head from the Warren Court that, like, courts are just frequently, and from the, like, what the Supreme Court was doing to the Biden administration, for example, that courts are just spending a ton of time second guessing executives,
Right.
and they just don't. Like, 9 times out of 10, they don't. They defer to the executive branch, usually for very good reasons, which is that the executive branch is the one with the knowledge of all the facts, and, like, conveying all the facts for all those things, at the level of you need in a court, is just an incredible time sink, and the judge doesn't have the substantive expertise to really parse it. You know, it doesn't make sense most of the time.
Right.
But if you're just bluntly ignoring a judge's injunction, that's something else.
Well, you brought up Marshall, cousin of Thomas Jefferson, right? The decision of that court as it concerned moving indigenous Americans westward out of Georgia got the famous, most likely apocryphal quote from Jackson, right? The Supreme Court has made its decision. Now let it enforce it. This strikes me, especially during our current positions, sir, that democracy really requires full participation, right? Participation from the other branches of government, from the other officials. If the executive branch chooses not to listen to a judge's order from a court's order, there is only so much that the court can do as a recourse, no?
Yeah, and I think that we, because of our political tradition, incorrectly think of things separately. Like that was my conclusion looking at that Voting Rights Act stuff.
Right.
We think the executive branch is one thing, the courts are one thing, Congress is one thing. It's just not true. Like the courts are part of the federal government,
Right.
and they are part of how the federal government implements the law. And so, sometimes they're at odds, but sometimes what people don't realize is that federal agencies, like executive agencies, are often at odds with one another. Our country is very bizarre in that we have federal agencies that take one another to court all the time. It's a very common occurrence. They sue one another. So like a regulator, say EPA, will take the transit authority to court or something. Based on what they allowed to occur. Um, and that's not a very good system design, but it's just sort of to the point that like all the agencies see the courts as sort of part of that their process for how to arbitrate disputes. They don't just turn around and ask the president, "Hey, which one of us is correct?" I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
And court intervention into these things is often as much assistance as it is stopping. So in the VRA case, the thing that became so big later and was gutted, by the Roberts Court, pre-clearance, was not considered very important when the law was passed, and that was the Warren Court that took something that some locality, I don't remember which one, was doing, and instead of saying this is illegal because it is discrimination, because it wasn't clear, it was one of those ambiguous cases, they instead said, well, you didn't get pre-clearance. You changed this after the law passed, and you didn't get pre-clearance with DOJ. And DOJ wasn't really doing much pre-clearance at that point. But essentially, through the Warren courts pushing, pre-clearance ended up being the biggest VRA activity in short order after that. So that was part of the courts working with the executive branch to figure out what the ultimate shape of implementation of the law looked like. It wasn't really an adversarial thing at all.
Right.
And there's tons of stuff like that. Now, again, I don't think that's the best way for that to work, but that is how it does work. The courts and Congress and the executive branch are part of the federal government, and they're not really separate. The Congress can't even pass a law without the president, unless they have supermajorities that are politically impossible in our lifetime.
I want to talk about the idea of charisma and personalism a little bit. A lot of the time when I bring up the idea of a charismatic leader or charisma, like I get a lot of laughter because nobody who's a liberal really thinks that Trump is very
anti-charisma.
charismatic.
Yeah.
Right. He's kind of gross and horrible and he can't make a joke and he's not like charming in like that, the sense that like maybe we would expect him to be.
Right.
But he does, if you like really think about it, hold sway with a lot of people. In your article, you mentioned that you only really need 5% of the population to be motivated to do violence on your behalf in order to create a kind of sense of terror and a sense of control. And you brought up Springfield, where in the pre-election period, we saw the town get sort of overtaken because it was made the focus of Trump followers, right? So how did Trump sort of gain that kind of charismatic sway over people, and what does he seem likely to use it to do?
I mean, I think so, like, to draw the parallel with Hitler again, as everyone does, I don't think any liberal today has any problem with the characterization of saying that like Hitler was charismatic and that was like part of his appeal. But if you said that to a German liberal at the time, before Hitler was chancellor, they would have had the same reaction that liberals do to you, saying that Hitler was a clown, he was a buffoon, like he just seemed. It's the same kind of thing. He was very boorish, like he wasn't sophisticated, he wasn't smooth. He was charismatic because he was a good public speaker, in the sense of like being able to command a crowd.
Right.
But Trump is different. Trump is not like he's not that because it's a different media environment. Trump is very much a product of TV, but he's an entertainer. I mean, and anyone who says Trump is not charismatic in a sense, like I could probably pick at least 5 different phrases that they use on a regular basis in jokes that all originate from Trump. Like
Absolutely.
in the era of us all hating Trump for being a president, you know what I
We
mean?
do
Like
quote him a lot, right?
a lot. We don't even notice it anymore.
Well, because
Uh,
he doesn't tell jokes. He says things that you
And they're just
hear
odd.
and they're
Yeah.
just odd, and you start laughing because
Yeah.
they're like ridiculous things for a person who's in a position of power to be saying. Kafefe?
I would say in the last week, I've probably said, I'm just now hearing this for the first time. I've probably said many people are saying,
Many such cases.
Yeah.
many such cases, and then just like finishing a thought with sad, like those are definitely things that Trump has done that have just like burrowed into our brains, right?
Yes. Even make America great again. Like everyone, like there was like a
Make
thousand
something
different like
something again.
yes. It's
Right.
like it's it's charisma in like the marketing sense. It doesn't have to be
Yes.
sophisticated.
Which, he didn't even invent that, right? That was already a political slogan,
Right.
Right.
but he brought it back in a huge way. And,
Right.
retro is always in.
Thanks, Pat Buchanan, and also people before that, and also people before that. Um, it is, and I wanted to touch on this point, Adam, because the Hitler comparison is really apt because the charisma, just like with Donald Trump, it's not the sort of charisma that liberals would ever absorb. It
Right.
is if you read the translations of what Hitler was talking about, he was a good orator, he was good at bringing a crowd together, but he's essentially saying the same brain rot
Yeah.
as the president
Yeah.
is, as any fascist leader does. It's all like, yeah, the people are coming here and they're messing up the blood of the nation, and like we've got to like rearm and do it right, and it's just nonsense, but it's the type of thing that gets the people going. No.
Yeah.
Well, we're not his consumer base, right? As
Right.
liberals, he's not really talking to us. His words only matter to us insofar as they impact us because they're being acted on by other people, right?
Well, also, the more that he pisses us off, the more charismatic he is to his audience. So he's also
Yeah.
charismatic in the sense that like he gets a reaction.
Right.
Like in 2015, people were incapable of ignoring him. They just could not, and that only grew with time. But also, just empirically, to your point you were making, Caitlin, at the end of the day, like God, how many people voted for him? What percentage of Republicans voted for him in the last primary? Like it was,
76%.
right? It's like an enormous. Like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like he just crushed everyone else. He started out with, in 2016, what maybe a third of Republican voters who were either going to vote for him or enthusiastically voting for him, and that was enough in a crowded field with no like if it wasn't just one other person who themselves had a lot of support to get into office. But then once from there, it's just grown. I mean, it's just grown, unfortunately for the world.
And they're right. Like nobody owns the libs like him. He does own us by ruining everything.
It's true. So Donald Trump runs a personalist administration. It is at the approximate time of this recording, just 2 months ish. Okay, not even half a year, not even a year. How long does this shtick work with the people who think that America's got to be made great again? How much longer does it function before spoils aren't enough to cover the gaps?
Well, I mean, I don't think he's doing a very good job of giving spoils. And part of this is because of when I wrote the piece that you're talking about, I really did not think Elon Musk was going to matter much. That was like my biggest miss, I would say.
Sure.
Like, and that's, with Elon Musk, it's personalism as well. It's a very different, in personalist systems are very, so Xavier Marquez is like the political scientist who is my guy to read for non-democracy analysis. He's written a book. He wrote like literally a month after the election, I think, published a paper on personalism. Um, and what he says about personalist systems is that they because they're all about deinstitutionalizing, it's sometimes actually very difficult to tell who has the real power.
Mhm.
Um, and that's Musk, right? He's got like a very weird quasi role with the government,
Right.
So I did
formally.
have a question about that too, because I really thought, and so far I've been proven wrong, that Trump would see the way that Musk has really taken the spotlight and taken the reins and appears to be the guy running the show, that he would be threatened by that and try to remove him.
Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't seem to be happening. Is it that Trump is just convinced that like this is my attack dog and I still own him, or what?
I
Like what's
I
happening?
honestly have no explanation, because it's not just because like in the past, in the first administration, just the fact that someone was treated as important in the news,
Yeah,
like Bannon, was enough to make Trump turn on him.
unacceptable. Yeah.
Well,
But like he invites Musk in to pretty much run cabinet meetings.
I
Um,
thought the picture of like Trump sitting down with all the
yeah,
other people on the at the table while Musk was standing up and everyone had to look at Musk, not at
right.
him. That
yeah.
didn't seem like it comports with my sense of
No,
Well,
like
democracy.
there was a second cabinet meeting right after that one where Musk essentially berated Rubio and a bunch of other people,
Mhm.
and Trump just sort of like weekly was like, oh, don't be so hard on him. Um, I mean, part of it is that Trump is very old,
right.
and I don't know how much he's all there.
Yeah,
Um,
does he just not have it in him to kind of
that's that's
stomp
that's really, but
Elon
that
down?
that isn't a very satisfying explanation, just because he's doing a lot of other things,
Right.
independently of Elon. So I don't know. I have no
Well,
explanation
I
for that, to be
suppose
honest.
Rubio's doing a lot of it too. Like with the immigration stuff, he's seems like he's kind of at the front of that.
I think that what's different about Trump 2 than Trump 1, and we heard it a lot during Trump 1, of all the quote unquote babysitters, right? All the people who were supposed to be the guardrails. We're not going to let
Mhm.
this thing get too hairy. And I think Trump really chafed at the perception that he was being babysat by Millie and by all these folks. And I think he has a certain level of comfort letting other people do his bidding because he feels completely in control
Mhm.
of creating these circumstances. No one is telling him what to do. He is saying, we're doing this and it's being done. And that is different. And I think he's behaving different. This is just an opinion of mine, of course. I think he's behaving differently as a result.
Yeah, I honestly can't say. I don't want to speculate too much, just because I've been
Right.
wrong about Musk. I also thought that Musk was going to end up just kicked out because of a conflict of egos.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would say, I do agree that Trump doesn't care about doing the job at all, as long as people are making liberals unhappy. Um, but
Yeah,
but
whoever.
but he does care about appearances, and like all the like the pictures and the videos of Musk leading the cabinet meeting, Musk being the one person who was talked to in like a interview situation, um, like Musk meeting with Modi in the White
Yeah.
House, like
Just the body positions where like Trump is always sitting down and Musk is always standing up. That just feels I
like and
wouldn't like
like
that
and
about
like
him.
Trump goes and like makes a show of like going in a Tesla. Like why? What? I don't really understand like the nuances of
Yeah.
that relationship,
I
to be
mean, that
honest.
part sort of fits into the spoils theory, right? Where he's just trying to get all of the resources of this country into the private possession of his allies, right?
Yeah, but yeah. Anyway, it's just strange because Musk, right? Musk, not only has Musk a big ego too, and not only is he a showboat, um, but he also is an independent base of power. He does not depend on Trump. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
Trump could hurt him if he chose to, because he
Right.
has the power of the federal government. He could destroy Musk's businesses very easily.
Right.
Yeah.
But as things stand, Musk is the biggest conservative donor, right? Like at least to Trump. I don't know
Mhm.
about in general, but pretty close, because he's still paying. He's still cutting those $100 million checks.
Yeah.
Um, he uh, he has he has X, so he has this network that is shrunk, but is still many orders of magnitude larger than Truth Social, and and he's got his sort of like Silicon Valley network of people. So like Doge is not beholden to Trump, but Doge is entirely beholden to Musk, hundred
Right.
Yeah.
percent.
Right.
I have to say, having grown up or spent, my young adult life in Silicon Valley, that whole culture was just waiting for a personalist sort of like hero
Oh,
worship
sure.
figure. It
Yeah.
absolutely was right, because we are
Absolutely.
constantly telling each other this myth of like all it
The
took was
founder.
one
The
amazing
founder.
genius in a
Yeah.
garage
Right.
with no
Yeah.
resources and a
Right.
vision, and they
Yeah.
created Silicon Valley, right?
Right.
And then don't think about, the oligarchs that like actually built all the buildings that we operate in right now, and all the
Right.
like basic American royalty and the eugenics and everything that went into
Yeah.
all of that. Let's just talk about like one real smart boy with a computer and a dream, and
Yeah. No,
he made
it's
it sound. I was working there when Steve Jobs died, and the whole place stopped functioning. Like everybody, it was
Sure.
like we were one step away from putting a black veil over our just like it. I had somebody call me. I was working at a tutoring center. I had somebody call me crying. She was like, "My daughter's not going to come to her tutoring session because our neighbor Steve Jobs died." Like she was absolutely flat,
uh,
not functioning, right? The hero
that was
worship.
that was a funny one for me because I was into technology enough at the time that I was like, oh yeah, maybe like it's kind of sad this big like this pioneer has passed. And then and the Isaacson book came out like 5 minutes later because of that.
Yeah.
And I read the Isaac book and I was like, boy, this guy was an asshole. This guy was a piece of shit. Like, I'm not saying he deserved to die or anything,
No.
but like he clearly took more credit
right.
for what occurred than he really deserved.
Yeah.
And he was an abusive boss. He was just an
Yes.
abusive person.
He
And
was, yeah.
and he was
And
a
cried and
he was a
screamed.
deadbeat dad.
Right.
So
Right.
like,
Right.
like
I have a signed copy of that book, actually. My husband got it for me.
Well,
Thanks, husband.
I we were talking about the perceptions of of Donald Trump, of the president, right? Of this personalist force, and noting that the body language doesn't seem presidential, doesn't seem powerful, right? But what happens if instead of conceiving himself as a president, the president conceived of himself as a king? Well,
Yeah.
kings stay
Sit
seated.
on that
They
throne.
they
Yeah.
have courtiers do all the work, right? They have courtiers talk to the ambassador, to the leader, right? I mean, the king of England wouldn't even respond to Napoleon because he was a commoner, right? In letters. And so we have this different perception. It doesn't hurt Trump to not feel presidential because Trump feels like a king. And so he's waited on, he's spoken to dotingly.
And he's got these like legal experts right around him who are the yes
right.
men, like Vermeul, right, who will say like, well, really, like the executive is in charge of everything actually, and shouldn't be held back by these illegitimate other powers. Yeah, I think that's a better frame, probably, is to think like, no, he doesn't need to physically be active and in front of everything, because he is confident in his status as the guy who can sit and allow his players to play. We also have a lot of like political comic drawing practices that involve giving him like a six pack and stuff, like just making him
Oh
look
gosh.
really heroic and amazing. And
What's that
you
guy's
know,
name?
uh,
The painter.
Garrison. No, who is
No,
that?
no, not the comic, but the actual like
Oh,
painter guy. You know what I mean? It's like
Yes.
no,
it's
you
like
guys know. Okay.
yeah, it's like he did a painting that was like of Obama like standing on the Constitution and all the former presidents being like, "What are you doing, man?" And then like in the Trump era, he like made a ton of money doing tons of like Trump is like a football player and like Trump
Yeah.
is like all this like stuff.
Yeah, they're always making him look more muscular, more virile, younger, more hair on his head.
The problem is that like the man lives in his chair. You know what I mean? It does not move
Right.
and makes zero effort.
That's right.
And eats the like absolute worst.
Just
You
like a
know,
king.
yeah,
Oh
I
man.
guess. I guess.
I mean, the politics of food here is just so interesting to go into. And I think it's like is it Talia Lavin who's gone into that in really in a lot of depth about like the way that that this kind of political group has talked about food and is dealing with food has just gotten so twisty and so weird, because there's like the anti-female like soy cuck thing, and then there's the you have to eat beef tallow so you don't get seed oils because the seed oils will turn you into a girl, and then but then you have this president who clearly is like all he wants is a Big Mac. Like and so you have to build that into your ideology after
Yeah.
you've been saying
Yeah.
all this stuff.
I just don't get it. The hero worship thing, it's
Oh,
incredible,
I
but
know.
it's very personalist.
But
I
again, the imagery was used, to kind of bring RFK Jr. to heel, right? By having him
like
enjoy fast
Right.
ripping.
food on the plane with them.
Oh, right.
Right. Right. And working out, that was a whole big thing when he was running. It's like, oh my goodness, look how muscular he is. And I'm like, is the presidency a weightlifting contest? Like, we
Yeah,
need a person
it.
who
I know. Well, that's you could see that like worldview in terms of how they're about to wreck our military.
Right.
Yeah.
They have this idea that, like the people who were so fascinated by the Russian recruiting videos where it showed how manly their
Right.
soldiers are, and it's like, yeah, but like what we need are people who, I mean, yes, like there's physical fitness involved in being in the military, obviously,
Yeah,
but
sure.
like you don't win wars by having the most physically fit military. Like you have it by having like the most sophisticated technology and having the best military doctrine in terms of how to make use of it and having people
Right.
trained to use that technology. Like it's
Yeah.
like it's a lot of like logistics and engineering and
then the
um,
people behind it negotiating
and
stuff
clerical
like
work.
things like
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
organization. Yeah. No, we got to
And
get rid of
that's
CI.
not new either. I mean, maybe the technology thing to a certain extent, but not really. I mean, the technology just looked different then. But like, certainly the reason that Rome conquered the Mediterranean, area is not because they had the strongest soldiers. It's because they had the best logistics.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Napoleon considered to be a great general, right? All of the great generals are considered to be great generals, not because they were hulking masses, not because they were beefcakes, but because they had good brains. They were like, oh, we should do
Yeah.
this and not this.
And I think like if I can, I don't know how much longer we have, but like just one like note I really want to make is that it's the contrast between like the cartoon version of how things work and how leadership works and the reality of how systems work.
Yes.
And so
It's like a child's fantasy.
my oldest child, and 8 years old, was complaining to me yesterday about how they learn about the civil rights movement. And at first I was like misunderstanding and being like, are you complaining about having to learn about the civil rights movement? And they're like, no, like, I just don't like how like the way they tell it to us is just like, well, they wanted to go and do the right thing. So they did the right, like it was just like this, like very moralist story.
Yeah.
When it's
Without
like, yeah,
like details of
right.
how it's
Which I mean, I understand. Like my kid is precocious. Like for
but they
most,
do.
for
They
most third
tell you. They tell you stuff that's simply not true. Like,
yeah,
the Rosa Parks story where they're like, she was just really tired, so she
right,
didn't get up.
right,
And it's like,
exactly.
no, she did so much work, like planning this with the boycott
Yeah.
movement. Like,
Right.
Yes, it was a strategic choice.
yeah, this was premeditated, and it's a good thing, and that's something to celebrate.
And you're absolutely right about Silicon Valley culture. These are people who are not children, who should know better. They have, but it's not just that they think it's one man, one founder genius who pulls it off. It is also that they think it is their companies that pull it off. When the American system, which is currently being dismantled as we speak, is that there's government money, there are some quasi-public, quasi-private institutions like universities, and there are entrepreneurs, and private companies. And the private companies in Silicon Valley are at the very end. They're the last mile of a very long pipe,
Right.
that they have very little to do with.
Yeah.
And they play a very important role. And I think it's wrong for people to dismiss what they do. But it's one small part. It's a very small part.
And we're going to see how they're not equipped to do the whole thing.
I mean, I'm sure that the people who are there now are fine with that. They're already billionaires. You know what I mean? But yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll experience it. Cool. Great. Yeah, I think it's really interesting the sort of rhetorical sleight of hand that happens where we talk about a nation and all the things that make a nation work, but then it always comes down to being about the person and the person's body. And that's why we're so obsessed with things like masculinity and making sure that our leader looks like a real man and
Right.
making sure that our country looks like it's run by a real man. Because we after all are simply squishy fleshy humans, and we're afraid of illness and injury, and we're
Right.
afraid that our country is also a squishy fleshy human that can be injured and made sick. So that like anxiety really does kind of run things some of the time.
Yeah.
Right. But the great leader, he is projecting. He's always projecting. And these pictures, right? Stalin with all the pockmarks brushed off of his face, and Mr. Trump with a six pack. It's all very much the same idea. We are the perfection that you should all be seeking, and you're not. And we're frustrated with that.
And it's branding.
Yes.
I remember in 2008, the Obama campaign and the way that people, liberals, reacted to it. Like that was also a case of like they had just like sky high expectations of this guy who was a junior senator, had not been in government for very long, did not have deep connections in DC.
Right.
Definitely an idealistic guy who had big ambitions going in. I think a lot of people have become cynical about that, and I don't think that's right. But the realities of governing as president are much more prosaic and much more difficult than just being a very charismatic person
Absolutely.
can overcome.
Yeah.
And I, this is one of the things I don't like about presidential systems is every 4 years we sort of run on who can be the most charismatic,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's healthy. Politics is always going to have some of that because there's always going to be a party leader or whoever it is who's going to end up prime minister or whatever it is.
Sure.
But like this, like every 4 years, like the guy who's going to win is going to be someone who can
Yeah.
personally energize the base because we have a very personal, like the orientation of our system is very geared away from parties and towards people.
Right.
And people think that's good, and I think it's very bad. And I
Yeah.
think Donald Trump is sort of like the extreme one extreme outcome of that kind of thing.
Well, we
Are
would.
you saying that Donald Trump isn't just in and of himself the one single problem and that he's a symptom of a larger systemic issue? Are you really saying that to me right now?
I would never say that.
We
In
Never.
front of my nice floral wallpaper?
we would never ask for the doctor who energized us. We would ask for the doctor who could help us be safe the best.
I mean,
Or
You
he
would.
put a
said
lot.
you say that, but I think a lot of people stick with the doctor that they are trying by.
Right.
Actually,
That's why that's
Right.
why the 50s was built by housewives on amphetamines, right?
Right. I'm drawn to somebody who knows a lot and is going to help me not die, but to each their own. And
it's
that
also
does.
just very hard for a patient to know who that person is going to be. And so when you don't know who that's going to be, at least you do know who's easy to talk to.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
like
But this is the
So
same thing in politics, right? We're not completely adapt to understand who
Yeah.
is the best candidate, but we do know the one that has the nicest smile.
yeah. In linguistics, we talk about how every person is a language user, sometimes of multiple languages, and that makes you, in a sense, an expert on your language. But you also have to learn a lot of things that are sometimes counterintuitive to understand, like the underpinnings of how language works. And it's the same thing about living in a country, right? You live in this
yeah,
country,
yeah,
therefore, you're an expert in the experience that you've had living in the country, but
Right.
you're not always going to be an expert in terms of selecting the people who should make up that government.
yeah. I'm going to be cruel to you and say that Hayek of all people made that point about language specifically. He said even a young child can be quickly becomes a master of language, but it takes experts with tons and tons of years of study to actually understand the formal logic of it underneath it.
Right.
Yeah. The liberal currents people like to bully me by quoting Hayek. It's a weird place in that Discord.
I just don't tell
I think
anyone that I also don't like Hayek.
I
Yeah.
think someone said that the liberal currents Discord is the only place you could find people who had a lot of deep history of both the the DSA and the Libertarian Party. And that's what they love about it. And
I have never been a member of the Libertarian Party, and I want you to take that back
neither have I.
right now.
No, neither have I. I know a lot more about both now because of the Libertarians Discord. But.
Right. Back in my atheist days, I was dangerously close to joining a libertarian group, but I never actually got there.
So Adam, as we roll towards finishing up this discussion, Adam Gurri, editor-in-chief with Liberal Currents, we really appreciate you coming on. I do have one more question, though. After Mao, as we noted, China decided to revert to a more functional, more stable, communal type of governmental organization that lasted until about Xi Jinping. Well, we hear lots about the chocolate eclair spined Republicans that are currently sitting in office. What happens when Donald Trump passes? Do they find their backbone all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, who can say? There's so many ways this can go. Is Trump going to voluntarily leave office in 2028? I honestly think there is a decent chance of that happening, because being term limited out isn't a form of losing, so he doesn't have to lose face by saying he lost.
Allowed,
Right,
yeah.
right.
Now, if he believes that by leaving office he'll be at threat of being put in jail, then who knows what happens. But whether or not, I don't know. There's so many. Frankly, I can't predict what the country's going to be like by the end of the year. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen to the GOP after Trump, because a lot of that depends on what happens in the meantime. Like what they actually do, what they actually permanently accomplish, permanently in the sense of like it takes work to undo, accomplish
Right.
During his term.
My question before we go is about like the listeners, really. And it's, now that we have had this discussion about what personalism is and how that's a way to think about what we're going through as a country, what benefit do you think it gives us when we're interfacing with our government and figuring out what we should be doing as citizens and as residents of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is what we're asking of our representatives, unfortunately, which isn't a very, satisfying answer. But for example, if Schumer had actually had a backbone and shut down the government, people asked what exactly should they ask for, and it's hard because they're in the minority, so like it's not actually a good bargaining position. But if they were in a bargaining position, what I would say is that before getting anything, you can't just pass a law, because when you're passing a law to stop an executive that's not following laws, it's like, well, they're just not going to follow that one either. We actually have to look for ways that we can make de facto changes. So like the one that I would say, if we are ever in a bargaining position with them again, we have some leverage. The way that I would use it is to force the Doge people out of their control of the sensitive systems. That would be a concrete one you could do. You would have to have someone that is trusted by our side to oversee that process, and then have someone that is trusted by our side to then be in charge of those systems, who would agree to not give it back. But it's stuff like that we should be looking to do. And that can be at the state level. We can be looking to talk to our representatives to try and get them to take measures to mitigate against what we know Trump is going to do to try and bully them into compliance, and at least get them to take a stance on what are you going to do if X percent of your federal funds are cut off, to make an example, like you better not cave. So what is it going to be? Like trying to get them on the record with that stuff, I think is also important, because it's happening. It's already happening. The University of Maine system is going to be bankrupted because they have allowed 2 trans athletes to compete in women's sports. Like what is the state of Maine going to do about that? They can't cave. I mean, they just can't. Like once you cave,
nothing
that's
good comes of that.
So, but maybe they will. I mean, they might. $400 million is a lot of money.
I know. We've just already seen how caving doesn't do anything except embolden them. So you gotta hope that they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Well, Sir Adam Gurri, our boss, we appreciate you so much for coming on and speaking to us, teaching us a bit about personalism, fielding some of our questions, both theoretical and practical. Will you come back sometime and do it all over again with us?
Of course.
Awesome.
We certainly appreciate that. So until we do this thing all over again, well, you all got to remember that understanding a question is half of an answer, and this is, of course, half the answer. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.